Sound-seeking monsters, families on the run, and the end of days. We're not talking about A Quiet Place, or Bird Box, or The Birds, or The Mist. This is The Silence. The Silence is a 2019 PG-13 horror movie directed by John Leonetti. John Leonetti is the guy behind such classics as Annabelle, Wish Upon, and Mortal Kombat Annihilation. It was written by Shane and Carrie Van Dyke. This is the writing team behind Titanic 2 and Transmorphers. Not Transformers, Transmorphers. The screenplay was adapted from the 2015 book of the same name by Tim Levin. The music is by Tom and Andy. The film was cut by Michelle Conroy. He edited some really great episodes of Vikings, Penny Dreadful, and The Killjoys. The film stars Stanley Tucci, Kiernan Shipka, Miranda Otto, and John Corbett. So the world is under attack by monsters who target their prey using sound. So a deaf girl and her family who are adept at sign language try to find their way to a safe refuge. So as you guys know, when I talk about movies, I talk about the good and the bad. That being said, let's talk about the good. Now, I haven't seen A Quiet Place yet, so I'm judging this movie on its own merits. I did like the introduction. It showed you where the creatures came from, how everything happened, and then it goes into this disorienting title sequence. I do have to say it's always nice to see people with disabilities represented in film, so I really enjoyed the sequences where they showed things from Allie's perspective. And not only is she deaf, but she has permanent tinnitus. And tinnitus, for those of you who don't know, is a ringing in the ears. I actually have that permanently as well from my time as a firefighter. It was really cool seeing the whole family use sign language throughout the entirety of the movie. The first act was pretty good. I thought it had a nice tense build-up, and it slowly starts to reveal things. I also thought the music by Tom and Andy was pretty good. It's definitely inspired by a lot of Philip Glass. You can hear there's a lot of influence from that. But I think it worked pretty well for the movie. I thought all the stuff they showed on social media and the news looked pretty cool. I like the presentation they did for the digital media. I thought Stanley Tucci and Miranda Otto did pretty good with what they were given. Stanley Tucci is always really good. He's really solid. But I think in this role, he was a great father figure. You know, he's nice and calm, he thinks about things, he's what you want a dad to be in the time of the apocalypse. There's a lot of nice touches of humanity in the film, little things that they do, stuff that they focus on. Sometimes they drop the sound out to put more emphasis on the things that are happening, and it really gives you more of an emotional impact, which is important. I really like the premise of the movie and a lot of the ideas that they show throughout the film. It's interesting enough that it has me wanting to read the book. There are a ton of nighttime shots and shots that take place in dark interiors in this movie. But one of the things I noticed because of this was the lighting. I thought the lighting in this movie was done very well. Michael Galbraith's cinematography was pretty nice. Even though you see what's going to happen pretty early on, some of the stuff that transpires in the third act was actually really cool. And they used a couple of fresh ideas that I hadn't seen in other horror films. A lot of people are comparing this to A Quiet Place and The Bird Box, and of course I did that jokingly at the beginning, but I don't think that's a really fair comparison. This book was written in 2015, and the movie was actually done, I guess, in 2017, but they didn't release it until now. So it actually happened before A Quiet Place came out. On a side note, there's something that's really been bothering me a lot about horror movie fans, right? So in The Bird Box, they didn't really show anything. They didn't explain where the creatures came from, what they were, nothing, right? A lot of people complain about that. And from what I understand, A Quiet Place shows a little bit of that stuff when it matters. And still people complain. And in this movie, they show everything, including the origins of the creature and how the outbreak started. And again, people complained. So I can't figure out what horror fans these days like. I myself enjoy a nice slow reveal, at least when it comes to creatures, and I obviously enjoy the origin stuff and things like that. And that really just depends on the film. With some films, that's really going to work, and others, it might not. Sometimes I like when a horror movie just throws you into the deep end. They don't tell you how things started, they just kind of put you in there, and then you have to figure it out as the movie goes along. I know a lot of people have short attention spans, so I'm sure that they love that this movie basically shows you where the creatures came from, shows you what they look like right off the bat in the beginning. You see it all, so I'm sure a lot of people watched it and enjoyed it. That being said, let's get to the bad. There is so much exposition in this movie throughout the entirety of the film. The director, the editor, everybody involved really needs to learn how to do a lot more show and a lot less tell. Speaking of show, I really enjoyed the sign language, but it was so inconsistent. There were many scenes where they were talking, but they weren't doing the sign language. I'm not sure why they did that. If they didn't do it in that scene, why do they have to do it in all the others, or vice versa? While I did like some of the music, they definitely used it way too much throughout the movie. This is a movie that focuses on sound. This is a movie that focuses on a girl's deafness and her tinnitus. There's a movie called Dante's Peak, it's like a volcano disaster movie or whatever. There's a part where this guy is trapped under all this rubble in his vehicle, and he has to get out before all the rubble collapses and crushes him and kills him. And as he's trying to get out of the back of the vehicle, you hear like the metal creaking, you hear little pebbles falling, you hear, the rocks starting to shift. It's a really tense scene. It really gets you scared for him. You really hope he makes it out alive. It's really great, and there's no music. And when they first did that scene, they had music in it, and the director and the editor said, you know what, this feels a little off, take the music out. And when they took the music out, it was so much more effective, and they kept it out. And that's what they should have done for a lot of the scenes in this movie. Use the sound of the creatures, the wind, the scratches, all that kind of stuff to build up that tension. When you're masking most of it with music, I don't know if they just felt like the sound design wasn't good enough, or they felt like there wasn't enough atmosphere in their film, but they definitely overdid the music. There were a couple of side scenes that really didn't have anything to do with the main story arc. I'm not sure why they threw them in there, like if they filmed them and then they were like, I'm not sure if this goes, but we'll put them in there anyway. They really poured on thick as far as the drama and how people would act in the end times. And then when something bad happens, they cut it and they don't show you. The movie is on Netflix, for God's sakes. Why were they so concerned about making it watchable for like a mass audience? Anybody can watch this movie. Hell, the Bird Box went even further than this movie with the violence and the scariness and all that stuff. And it's not just the violence that felt really timid. The whole movie holds back. It's too restrained, especially for like an end times apocalypse movie. There are so many holes in the logic of this film and the logic of the characters. It really takes you out of the movie. I mean, you can only turn your brain off so much. You can only do the suspension of disbelief so much when so much dumb stuff is being thrown at you, and so often. And although I do love seeing people with disabilities represented on screen, there's a couple things that I gotta mention. I think Kiernan Shipka is a pretty great actress. I love her in The Chilling Adventures of Sabrina. But why didn't they cast an actual deaf actress in this movie? It would have given it a much more authentic feel, and it just feels like it would be the right thing to do because there are quite a few deaf actresses out there. Also, her character's been deaf for over 3 years, and her speech is perfect. She can read lips perfect. The whole family speaks perfect sign language. While I can buy the sign language part, because of course, if someone in your family goes deaf, you're going to work really hard to learn sign language so that you guys can communicate. But what I don't buy is the fact that her speech is still perfect. While I'm not a doctor or an expert on the deaf, I have had some deaf friends, and the thing is, their speech eroded over time. They don't have perfect speech. So even though she's had no hearing for 3 years and her speech is still perfect, I don't think so. And even though there are some touches of humanity in this film, there's a few relationships that really needed a bit more time, a few more scenes to really help them develop. And that way there would be, again, more of an emotional impact when things happen, whether they be for the good or for the bad. Anytime you have a movie about families in the end times, that is a key element. You have to have a lot of emotional connections and a lot of depth to these relationships and, the characters, the family members themselves. And unfortunately, other than maybe Stanley Tucci, this movie really fails in that. While the design of the creatures is practical, it's fairly bland. I wish they had done something more exciting. And I definitely wish they had taken more time with the CGI, because the CGI is pretty spotty. And honestly, the creatures in the movie do not feel threatening at all. Throughout the entire film, I never was worried for the characters. I didn't care about the creatures and what they were going to do. There's only one point in the movie where you see the creatures do something and you're like, oh damn, that's pretty rough. But that's it. The rest of the movie, you're just like, they're basically bats who bite harder than normal bats. As a whole, the family just feels flat emotionally. I'm not sure why. Even Stanley Tucci, even though he does great acting and I love his father figure and what he does, they never have like really intense reactions or emotional outbursts, whether they be crying or anger or anything. It just feels like things don't have consequences in this movie. Even when people die, from their group or the outside, other people or whatever, you don't ever feel like, holy shit, man, that's so rough. Man, I can't imagine how that would be. It never resonates with you because they don't put that across. And the thing about horror movies is most of the time a horror movie will come up with a set of rules and the people have to, live or work by them, as do the creatures. And you should always be consistent with those. Stick to those rules so the audience can follow them and so that the movie is more cohesive. And there's a few parts where you really get taken out of the movie because there's a certain sound or somebody does a certain action. You're like, man, if they had done that, I think the creatures would have swarmed. Why would the creatures do that? Or why would these people do this? So that's a pretty big weak spot when it comes to the creatures. Establish your rules and stick to them, people. Now, I'm not sure about the book, but the movie is just filled with end time tropes, stuff you've seen in every other apocalyptic movie. When you get to the third act, you see this final conflict happening. It's broadcasted from a mile away. They really build up to it with a lot of news clips and little pictures while she's on her iPad and stuff. Because even though it's the apocalypse, she still has Wi-Fi. And while the creatures don't feel really menacing, they do introduce another antagonist later. But he and some other characters come off as really cheesy because it's just not the right casting, and there's certain shots and certain effects that they have that they just don't work, and you don't feel, again, menace from these people. So the creatures don't have this menacing aura about them. The human antagonists don't have any menace to them. So nothing feels, again, like there's any stakes in this movie. There's too much sitting down in this movie. They're sedentary for too much of the film. It definitely should have been more of a road movie, and, they were trying to get away from things for longer. I think it would have been more effective. You would have felt more peril. You would have worried about them more. And because you don't really see this long trip, you don't feel tired. You don't feel exhausted with them. You don't feel emotionally worn out. So there's no emotional impact when something happens at the end, whether it be for the good or the bad. And you guys know I love time jumps. I've talked about that before. Time jumps, I think, are fantastic when they're used properly. But in this movie, you don't see what happened as a result of something that was really big and really important to the film. They just go straight to this other thing, and you're just like, okay, what the hell happened in between? So this movie really fails when it comes to using time jumps. And throughout the film, there's this monologue that Kiernan Shipka's character has, and it's just really obvious exposition, and it's trying to fill in blanks. It's almost like they added it to try to make up for their lack of narrative structure in a lot of the story. Or maybe they threw it in there to help dumber audiences understand, because surprisingly, when I went online to get the trailer for the edit, there were tons and tons of ending explained and, the silence explained videos on YouTube. And I was sitting there like, why does it need explaining? It was so obvious and it was so simple. But I think the overall weakness of this film comes down to the screenplay. But then again, we're talking about the guys who wrote Titanic 2 and Transmorphers. I'm a massive fan of horror. I was excited to see this movie. I didn't watch the trailers because I didn't want anything ruined, but I knew that Stanley Tucci and Miranda Otto and Kiernan Shipka were in it, so I was like, oh, okay, this could end up being pretty good. And then just little by little, that excitement went down, 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 down. And that's because this movie kind of fails at almost every level. Well, I think that's a bit unfair. It's just average at every level. It's just kind of there. It doesn't do anything to really surprise you. There are a couple little things that are really cool, but for the most part, it just didn't really do anything for me. I didn't hate it. I didn't love it. That being said, what is my score? Drum roll, please. 4 out of 10.